911, what are you reporting?
I got a strange going on out here. Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Damn it, I'm really confused. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence, and he was dead when she hit the ground. I didn't see any cars. All I saw was my dog coming over the fence.
What are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was?
It was standing up. I'm out here looking through the window now and I don't see anything. I don't want to go outside. Jesus Christ, you better...
Sure.
See ya!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Jerimiah Byron from the Bigfoot Society podcast. Welcome to the show, Jerimiah.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me on. How's it going?
I'm good, man. I've been wanting to have this conversation forever. It's rare that I find other podcasters that I enjoy listening to. So when I do, I like to reach out and try to get them on the show and collaborate in some way. So I appreciate you taking time to be with us today for sure, man.
Totally, dude.
So let's get right into it. The question on everybody's mind, or at least mine when I meet somebody new, is what got you interested in the Sasquatch Bigfoot thing in the first place?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good place to start. So it goes back to when I was a small young kid, probably around 9 to 10. Used to watch a lot of stuff on TV with my dad. Like everyone has this story where it's like, oh, we used to watch, In Search of on reruns, or like, Robert Stack stuff, and that kind of plants the seed. And then as I got into high school, I was out of it, But then it's something like it was like early mid-20s. I think it was because I started working at Apple, and if you work at Apple, so I don't speak for the company, but you there's a lot of interesting people. So like it helped me rediscover that weird side of myself again, right? So I worked with a few guys, and we were like, oh, we were talking about cryptids and whatever, just because we're, talk about weird stuff when you work there. And we found out, hey, there's a local cryptid in our area, which is not Bigfoot. It's called Van Meter Visitor, but this is important because so we started to go to the festival there, 20 minutes away from where we all live. One of my guys is filming the documentary interviews for Terror in the Skies by STM, Small Town Monsters. And he says, hey, Jeremiah, tag along. It'll be fun. And when he's there, he's like, hey, I need you to be the guy who's off camera asking questions so I can get the stuff that's going to be in the doc. And I'm like, oh, my goodness. So that was all like he had bullet points, but he was like, just come up with something on the fly. And as I'm talking to people like Chad Lewis and Steve Ward there, I'm like, something clicked. I'm like, oh my goodness, I love this. Like, this is amazing. I'd never done anything like that before, and I just loved it. Fast forward a little bit, then I decided, hey, started listening to podcasts. I was like, oh, I want to do this myself because I have questions to ask. And then I started this podcast on Anchor, which is Bigfoot Society, back in 2019, right? About 200 episodes into it. Along the way, I started getting some really fun connections, and I really started zoning in on Bigfoot. It's called Bigfoot Society at the beginning because of a keyword thing, because, everyone's looking for Bigfoot. But then I started really getting into it. Like, the lore is crazy with Bigfoot. So fast forward to last summer, my buddy Tate Hieronymus was like, we got to get you out in the field. You got to see what it's actually like. So we could talk about this later if we want, but we ended up going to a place he has in Iowa, research area. And after that weekend, I have no doubt in my mind that Bigfoot is real. I mean, yeah, it was nuts. So it was kind of a slow burn going from cryptids into like, oh, this Bigfoot stuff is really cool. The lore here is amazing. It's all over the world. And then kind of sprinkling in some other ancient America. I'm a person with a lot of questions, and the digger the the more you dig, the more interesting things you find and the more strings you start pulling. So I enjoy doing stuff like that. So that's kind of how I got where I am today.
I got you. And it's sort of the same process
Mhm.
that I went through to start my show. And it's always fascinating to me, the people that get into the podcasting world, because I never in a million years thought that I would ever be doing anything like that, what I'm doing today.
Sure.
But it started with that interest, right? I had these experiences when I was a kid. I had this interest in Bigfoot all my life, growing up in rural North Georgia. And so it's always fascinating to see what that journey looks like for everybody who comes on the show, whether it be Ron Moorhead or
Mhm.
Les Stroud or you or whomever. And it usually starts with something that you've seen on television. It's the In
Right.
Search of, or it's the unsolved mysteries, which I used to love as a kid. It used to scare the shit out of me, but I used to love to watch it, right?
Right.
And to get into the podcasting thing, it was sort of like a way for me to do the research, because I wanted to document as many cases as I could here. We live in North Carolina now, but I'm from the
Okay.
southeastern United States, and I always wanted to document as many cases as I could from the southeastern part of the country, because a lot of people don't think that these things exist over here. I've had Peter Byrne on the show, and we argued about that, whether they existed, east of the Rockies or not. So obviously, I like to know what that process looks for everybody. And let's talk a little bit about the podcast. You started it back in 2019, and you've had some really, really cool people on the show. Is there anything that has stuck out for you since that very first episode? One guest in particular, or one story in particular that has stuck out to you over the course of the last 4 years you've been doing the show?
So there's been a few, and I love focusing on getting like the actual story of the person. I just think that's really cool. So one that I had recently that was really really fun was so usually how, and before I say who it was, usually how it happens is I'll watch some old documentary and I'll just be like, oh man, that guy is super cool. I wonder if he's still alive because these documentaries are old. It was a documentary from the 90s. Um, and so I was able to talk to Henry Franzoni uh, eventually. That just happened maybe a month ago or less. But he had such a cool story, and it was wild, like because there's different ways of looking at Bigfoot. There's the great ape. There's the stuff where is he going through different portals, dimensions, stuff like that. And so Henry's viewpoints might be a little unorthodox, but his story is so cool. How like he was able in the mid 90s, he had this encounter, and then a year or so later, like right away, he met Peter Byrne, all these guys, and he got on the board of Byrne's research team, and he was just having crazy adventures, and he was like making websites back in the 90s for like all the people that you've heard of, and Bigfoot way back technology wise, and it was just I love stuff like that. Also, the documentary is Drumming for Bigfoot. That's the name for it. You can watch it on Tubi. It's amazing. It's 90s. It's a 90s Bigfoot documentary set in the Pacific Northwest. And the thing is that there's no history about it on the internet. And I was like, I gotta get the history from Vansoni. And he went into the history and like how it started, all the stuff that got cut. There was stuff about sea monsters that got cut because it wasn't about Bigfoot. And it was just like that to me was the perfect interview because that stuff I wanted to know. And Matt Pruitt gave me some great advice, the guy from Bigfoot and Beyond, right? And he's like, talk to people you want to talk to about people or about things you want to talk about, right? So the two things right there. Another interesting episode I've had recently was, so we're both on TikTok, and as you know, the TikTok Bigfoot audience is an untapped wealth of amazingness because there's all these people on there that have these stories that have never talked. So out of nowhere, this guy named Robert from Oklahoma comes to me, and he starts talking to me, and he's talking about all this stuff he had happen in Oklahoma back in the day, and these stories. And so I got him on for a members episode, and that to me was just one of the most shocking episodes, just how real it was in the stories he was sharing about, like, you know, and this was another gentleman's story he was sharing secondhand, but the guy was up in the hunting stand, and he watched the Bigfoot run towards some pigs on all fours and then get up on two and just like pretty much smack the pig and break its neck. It is intense, dude. I was just like, holy mackerel. So yeah, if you're not on TikTok, and I know there's all sorts of stuff you can think about it, but if you're into Bigfoot, get on TikTok, because the stuff you're going to find there is going to blow your mind, and people are talking. So those are the ones that, and I've had Cliff Barrickman on, Ron Moorhead, and those were awesome. Those are great. But I love finding like those nuggets that like people have forgotten about because it's 30 years ago, or like people have never talked about. Everyone wants those, right? And I love those personally. So
Yeah, I'm the same way, man. So I look back at some of the early episodes that I did when I had 25 people listening to the show.
Oh yeah.
And I was scrambling to try to get somebody each week to do a show. And those are some of my favorite. I've really went back and remastered several of them to put them out recently, because there's some of those nuggets, right? Some of those stories are some of the most compelling that even to this day that I've heard almost 300 episodes of the show in. And it's kind of the same thing for me, getting the big names and talking to Les Stroud and Ron Moorhead and just legends that are in the Bigfoot community are great, but it's really about documenting those firsthand accounts from Joe Schmo, who was just going out to his deer stand and had this amazing encounter with something that he can't explain. So that's really what it is about. And that's one of the things I love about your show, because you do a lot of those kind of interviews. And I, as a podcaster, certainly appreciate your approach to that, because you can see, A, it's sincere, and B, the guest is picking up on that. And it's a delicate thing to do when you're a podcaster. It's not the easiest thing in the world just to turn the microphone on and build a rapport with somebody, sometimes for the very first time.
That is so, people don't realize how hard that is. Oh man. And Brian did jump in here, because it's like there's been some episodes where it's like, man, those first 10 minutes are just like touch and go, and you're like, can I get this to click? And it's like click, and you're like, oh yes, thank goodness. So when you're doing an hour interview, man, those can be dicey. That's why I started doing longer interviews. Gives yourself more time to kind of like, jive with the person. So
yeah, and that's one of the things that it's a little secret sauce. I've talked about a little bit on some of the live shows. I think I was over on Squatch Talk with Pat Turner, and Pat asked me about vetting some of the people that have been on the show. And my answer is no, I don't. Outside of having conversations, and we send out some questionnaires beforehand to sort of weed through what I call the crazy. But in general, no, my philosophy with this has always been, I want to hear the story from the person for the first time as the audience hears it, because it is 90% of the time it's pre-recorded. And the only editing I do is just production value. It's not to change the story. So I want to hear it at the same time that the listener hears it, because my reaction is going to be genuine at that point. And I hear some crazy stuff that comes out of people's mouths, just like the audience. And I know you get into other things on the show. So before I want to get to your outing with Tate Hieronymus, Tate and I were talking about that the other week when I had him on the show.
Oh, okay, cool. Nice. Yeah.
But let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that go on. And some of the other things that you talk about on your show that I talk about, and I'm sure you probably get as much crap from your listeners as I do, because it is Bigfoot Society and Sasquatch Odyssey. So if you start talking about UFOs and aliens and rakes, then everybody gets their panties in a wad. But It's just like the episode
Yeah.
that aired today. It's the 22nd of January as we record this, and I put out a bonus episode this morning of the show with Preston Dennett and Dolly Saffron, and they were talking about her UFO experiences from the time
nice.
she was 10 months old. And she's talking about being selected as a pilot to pilot these alien craft. It's a lot, right? It's a
Wow.
lot to get into.
That's a cool story though. That sounds awesome.
But I've already gotten messages from some of the listeners going, please just stick to Bigfoot. That lady was out there. She's crazy. And my answer to that is always, well, how do you know that? Right? If you don't have evidence to the contrary, maybe that's just her experience. I don't know if her experience is true or not. My philosophy on my show has always been take what you want and leave the rest. It is her story, it is her experience. How much of that have you run into when you've looked into some of these other things, whether it be weirder cryptids or even the UFO thing?
That's a good question. So I think the nice thing about it is that even though the name is Bigfoot Society, I never put it forward as I'm only Bigfoot. Like at the beginning, it was more like cryptozoology. Then it kind of it morphs as I go along. Now, just recently, I've started, and I'm as I can get these people to come on, I'm starting to put in more high strangeness. Ancient America. I just talked to Travis Roy about giants of ancient America a few back. That was cool. I haven't gotten any pushback yet, but I think the cool thing is that your best listeners, right, they're in it for you, because it's like it doesn't matter like what you talk about. Like when you can talk, this is like think of famous podcaster, and it's like he can talk about anything because people love him for who he is. I think that's kind of what you have to find your best audience, right? But yeah, because I've had some weird ones, man. Like the one with Missy about her rake encounters, and oh man, and it was at the end we got into how she has this back and forth with like a previous government contractor and like all that jazz, and it's like holy mackerel, that is one of my favorite stories that I've heard someone tell me. And when she releases more info about what's going on with this guy, it's going to blow everything up in the cryptid community. And the rake stuff, like in that episode, I love helping people and connecting people. I was like, you got to go to your local sheriff's department and ask them if they have a folder of weird stuff. And I let her say what maybe something will, I don't know, maybe something will come of that. Who knows? But yeah, listeners, if you haven't gone to your sheriff's office, hit them up and be like, hey guys, do you have a folder of weird stuff? But I've never gotten pushback yet. I'm sure it's coming. And there's some stuff on TikTok and you're like, hey bud, you're not the best at what you do. And I'm like, okay, wink wink, I'm fine with what I do and I love it. So you get past that, right? But not too much.
There's always those naysayers out there.
Oh,
of course, no matter what you do, that's going to happen.
Not a big deal.
Let's talk a little bit about the lore. You mentioned the legend and the lore surrounding Bigfoot in particular. Let's talk a little bit about that. And is there any stories, like I've done the Osman story, I've done the Ape Canyon, I've had Mark Marcel on the show, and I've just done other shows that sort of delved into Ape Canyon is one of my favorite
it's so fun
sort of legendary stories surrounding Bigfoot. Is there any that stick out to you that you've enjoyed, and where are you on the authenticity of some of those stories? Do you think it's more legend or lore, or do you think there's actually a there?
So my personal and when I should preface, like when I'm talking about lore, here's what I'm referring, because that can go a lot of different ways, right? So what I like to do is get a hold of these old like 1970s Bigfoot newsletters. I don't know if you've seen any, and like you read through them and there's this one paragraph and it's like this happened and this, and you're like, I've never heard of that. And then so when I'm like thinking of lore, I'm like, oh, this guy found like the skull in the Sierras. What's that? Like the minaret skull? And then I start digging deeper and it's like, oh, Matt Moneymaker wrote an article about this. This is something I'm looking into right now. So it's really got and then I'm like, oh, it's like potentially stuck in this like university backlog museum warehouse. Did anyone ever find it? So now I'm down that rabbit trail to try to figure out. And who knows, maybe they did find it, or maybe it's just Indiana Jones in the warehouse. But I love stuff like that. Another cool thing like that is I spent like 3 months going down this rabbit trail because of a paragraph in one of David Weatherly's books about Iowa cryptids. And it was about the Iowa Bigfoot Information Center in Des Moines. And I was like, that's a place I've never heard of. Turns out I did all this like research on newspapers.com, looking through old newspapers, tracked down the guys in charge. You know, they're passed away, except for the one guy is still around, and I tracked him down, and I was able to actually get the history of what this like information center was that wasn't written down. And it was so cool. And this is stuff where it's like these guys were taking reports in the 1970s about there's a ton of Bigfoot sightings in Iowa, where I'm from. And it just got crazy. So, like, one of the most famous Bigfoot sightings in Iowa is the Lock Ridge Monster over in the east side of the state. And like Kevin was totally one of the guys that took the report. So I was like, he hadn't dealt with Bigfoot for 50 years, 40, 50 years. And I was like, hey, just so you know, that report you took in the late 70s, that's a big deal in the Bigfoot community now in Iowa. And he's like, oh, no way, really? So it's like, I love digging up the old stuff that people forgot about. That's what I think of lore. But then, you're talking about stuff like Ape Canyon. Oh man, that stuff is really cool too. Like, I was able to talk to Mark Mersell in person at Crypticon. Oh, the guy is such a wealth of information. Another cool thing that I've been digging into is, I'm sort of newer to Bigfoot, so a lot of stuff I might say, you'd be like, oh, I saw that when I was like age 2. But that's your audience might be thinking. But like BigfootEncounters.com was new for me. I don't know if you've ever been to that website. Oh man. The lore on that website that's not readily available in the community anywhere else will blow your mind. It is so good. Those 1800s cowboy Bigfoot sightings. That's some good stuff, dude.
Yeah, I love the older stories. That's Matt Pruitt and I go down that rabbit hole every time I get to talk to Matt, is some of the more historical stuff and looking into things that could or could not be related to Bigfoot, right? It's, you have to look at the nomenclature and the day, these wild man encounters that people were having. I personally think there's certainly something there. The Ape Canyon thing sticks out to me because I've had conversations with Mark about it, and the knowledge that he has is well beyond most anybody. He's forgotten more about Ape Canyon than most people will ever know about any given subject.
Yeah.
But there is something to those older stories that seem to be just enduring to people, right? The Patterson Gimlin film comes to mind. It's one of those things that it's not a story. Obviously, it's a piece of film from 1967. And you see that, and where are you on the PG film? Obviously, you've seen that. You got to take a look at that, just like we all have. And I'll be honest, I've talked about it on the show so many times. I'm 50-50 most times about whether it's a legit film and whether it's not. Sometimes it's 70-30, sometimes it's 80-20. But I still have that little bit of doubt. Where are you on the PG film and its authenticity?
So like I've gotten to talk. The cool thing about this is like I've gotten to talk to a lot of people that know a lot of stuff and a lot more than I know. And I've talked to people like, Daniel Perez, Tate Hieronymus. I've talked to a lot of people in the Bluff Creek Project. Personally, I think it's legit. Are there a lot of really interesting things that people can bring up? Oh, yeah. Oh, totally. If you want to go down that rabbit hole of just there's so many things that you can bring up. But it's like if you just look at the film for what it is, I'm like, you can see the muscle move, dude, in the leg. How are you going to fake that? Like, that for me is enough. And I mean, I know that you can get so deep into it and you can be like, well, the film developed and the camera's this and the blah, blah, blah. And you can like you can red string on the board all over like crazy. But for me, if I just look at the film for what it is, from what my knowledge, and like I can't get over that whole muscle moving on the back leg. It's like, dude, how do you fake that with think of the technology in 67, think of the Planet of the Apes costumes. It's like, dude, there's no, yeah, that's how I feel about it. And it's just, it would be so hard for two cowboys to fake that. They're not, I mean, hats off to Mr. Gimlin, but like, man, I don't see how they could be crazy hoax in that. I don't know. It's just that for me, it's the muscle in the leg. And my buddy, Jonathan Easley, brought that. We were talking about that one day, and it's just from Western Bigfoot Exploration. And it's just, you look at that muscle moving, you're like, man, that's it for me, dude.
Yeah, that usually puts me, after conversations like this, I shift to like 70-30, 80-20 in that direction, right? And then right. I'm here by myself, and I look at my photo on the wall, and I'm like, God, is that a dude in a suit? Let's talk a little bit about that. That's something that's come up recently a ton of times on the show for me, is just the evidence in general. We've been talking about things like Ape Canyon, and we're talking about the Patterson-Gimlin film from 67, right? So let's talk about some of the stuff that's more recent. And I've had this conversation, like I said, several times over these last few months, because I'm banging my head against the wall here, because I do this because I want to seek answers for myself. And I want to be convinced without a shadow of a doubt that these things are in fact real and still here. They could have been, we've even done shows with the Kentucky X-Files guys about their theory that Patty might have been the last of her kind. So there's all kinds of things out there, right? Well, for me, it's the evidence. It comes down to evidence, right? There has to be something that we can take a look at that says it proves that Bigfoot exists beyond a reasonable doubt. At least we're talking court of law now, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt. I think we're probably beyond a reasonable doubt already, but let's say we're looking for definitive 100% proof outside of a body. The evidence that's out there, I was having this conversation with Pat recently on Squatch Talk, and we were talking about, he gave the analogy of being, the Patterson-Gimlin film put the Bigfoot ball on like the 5-yard line.
Sure.
And we basically haven't moved there maybe 5 or 10 yards in the last 50 plus years. So what do you think about that? What do you think, or what do you find as far as compelling evidence to you that if you haven't seen one of these things and there's not a body on the slab, that would tend to point you in the direction of, yes, these things are real? Is it footprints? Is it sounds? What is it for you?
So usually when people ask me something similar to this, I actually don't bring up the PG film, because for me, like, it's not my number one evidence. What I really like is I really like what the Olympic Project is doing with the nest sites, because, dude, it's like, how do you explain that away where they're in the middle of nowhere, literally, and there's these nests that have been made, and they've had primatologists look at them, and the primatologists are like, that's exactly like what the apes in the zoo are making. And you're like, dude, if it's not some sort of undiscovered gritty ape out in the woods, what is out here? Like, that is the evidence that blows my mind. Yeah, the sound is fun to listen to. I love a good sound recording and a wood knock and all that, but it's like, that's the Olympic Project stuff is the stuff that I can't explain away. And for me, that is number one.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, man. I had Shane Corson on the show last year, and Shane and I talked about it, and it's hard to dispute what they're finding, and they're finding new nest sites. And I've even had a conversation with a guy up in New York State last year who found a very similar site to what they're finding out in the Olympic Project in upstate New York, right? So it's sort of that correlation that happens. And I think that's why it's so important that we collect these anecdotal stories from everywhere and listen to everybody's story, because we're building sort of, podcasts like yours and mine and Wes at Sasquatch Chronicles. We're building it's a complete database of all of these amazing stories that have happened over so many decades, and you
Mhm.
start to see those correlations, right? Because the same thing's happening in Florida that's happening in the Pacific Northwest.
Yep.
I've even talked to people in the UK who claim to have had encounters with Bigfoot. So, you know, take it for what it is and take it with a grain of salt. But I think that's one of the things that has stuck out to me is like the Olympic Project doing what they're doing. And then people are finding these things in other places, other places other than even upstate New York. So let's talk a little bit about your recent adventures. I know you got to go out with Tate. We mentioned it earlier
Yeah.
on in the interview. So why don't you tell us what happened once you guys got out there? Give us the
Yep.
whole
Yep.
kit and caboodle. What happened? What'd you see? And
It was fun. So he's been trying to get me to do something for a long time. And eventually it was at the point where he was like, I'm going to be in Iowa. It's going to be not super far distance away from where you are. So you have no excuse. And I was like, you know what? I really don't. I don't, I was like, sold a few extra shirts. Some people sent some, donations my way, which I appreciate. I was able to buy some gear. And so we went to an area in Iowa, um, heavily wooded area. And we went there for a Saturday afternoon to Monday morning, right? So we get there Saturday Saturday afternoon, and it's 110 heat index, which is hot for Iowa. So we are just like, oh, we're dying. We're trying the best we can. We're hanging out. The first day it was so hot. We were like making camp, and we were like, oh, it would be cool if we could hear something. I learned so much during that weekend that helps me with interviewing people because I didn't realize that, hey, if you're going to do stuff at night, you should probably take a nap sometime in the day so you don't get super tired. So Tate's like, I'm going to go take a nap in my truck. And I'm like, that's weird. And he's like, dude, if you don't, you're going to get super tired. And I'm like, oh, totally. So I'm like hanging out by the campfire while he's snoozing in his truck. And I was like on high alert, right? Because it's first time squatching. And so I'm like looking at my phone in the fireplace and I'm like totally distracted. And all of a sudden, like, thought I heard something to my left in the woods. And I was like, oh my goodness, was that a knock? And I talking to Tate later. I didn't have a recording. And he was like, well, it was kind of windy and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I might have misheard that. So I learned some lessons right off the bat, which is be recording because the next day is when the stuff happened. So temperature dropped about 30 degrees. Once it started, I also learned when you're camping, or it's pretty much camping, when you're bigfooting, you got to spend a lot of time just hanging out until you get to the point when Bigfoot's going to get rock and rolling, unless you're in area X and it happens all the time, but you're not. So it starts to get dusk, right? And all of a sudden, me and Tate are hanging out by the fire. This part is not recorded, which we kick ourselves daily. He probably brought this up too, because all of a sudden in the woods, probably about like 30, 40 feet, hear this huge tree, which I heard and he heard as it got pushed over. I was like, is that a firework? And he's like, dude, we're in the middle of nowhere. There's no fireworks out here. That was a huge tree getting pushed over or falling over randomly. We think it was pushed over. There was no wind at that time. And we're like, holy mackerel, this is crazy. And of course, like, why didn't we have the recorder on? After that, seconds later, I was like, recorder's going on now for the rest of the time. So we had it on. We're hanging out. We're like, we're getting weird vibes. Tate's like, I'm going to start doing a knock. So he goes over to a tree, gets a knock going. And then, like, I want to say it was like less than a minute afterwards. It was really quick. We heard a response knock to the right of the campsite. We got that on video. That's on Tate's. Tate was making a documentary, and you can watch that on his YouTube channel. There's the Iowa episode, and you can hear that audio on there. So we had weird stuff happening the whole night. Mostly knocks. There was no vocal recordings. In that area, though, there's been a research group in Iowa where they have captured vocal recordings just in a different part of the wooded area. So I had the recorder going on all night long, which another thing I learned is if you record 7 hours of audio, it takes a long time to go through it. So that took me a few weeks. But when I finally got through it, a lot more knocks, a lot of coyotes. I also learned that there's certain owls that can sound like monkeys, because that I was like, holy mackerel, guys, I got a herd of monkeys. And they're like, actually, that's just an owl, bud. And I was like, okay, I didn't know. So, but here's the weird part. So it was around 3:30, 3:45 a.m. And there was a bunch of knocks that recorded. But then the weird thing is, and this audio is in the episode too, is that, I'm in a tent by myself. Tate is in the truck. So I'm in my tent all alone. And it picks up on the recorder a zipper being unzipped. And I didn't leave the tent at all to go to use the facilities. So I'm like, ever since then, I was like, oh my goodness, this makes me feel crazy. Like, this makes me feel really uncomfortable, but also crazy. And I was like, man, I don't know how I'm going to get over this. But then fast forward, I had 2 interviews where one was a gentleman from down Missouri, and he was talking to me how they got recording of Bigfoot getting into their camp and like messing with stuff that was zipped up and unzipping it. And also there was another gentleman I want to say it was in the Pacific Northwest, where he had a story where there was a young lady in a tent by herself, and the Bigfoot was pretty much messing around trying to get into the tent and unzipping the tent. So it's like, then I had these 2 things that like told me, well, dude, maybe it's not that crazy. So Tate was like, the thing you need to realize is this sort of stuff happening does not happen every time you go Bigfooting. Like, this was very unique for your first time. So yeah, it was a pretty intense time. I learned a ton, and it's helped me as I interview people about their Bigfoot research. And hopefully I get to go out again someday somewhere. So
Sounds like you guys had a little bit of something going on. So that's really cool, man. I've had things happen here around the property just in general, and it freaks you out. And I can only imagine being out in the middle of nowhere and hearing those kind of things going on. Let's talk a little bit about something that came up recently. I had my second interview with Ron Moorhead. I had Ron on early on the show, and he's doing a conference here in North Carolina. So they reached out and asked me to have him back. So I did. And that aired this past Friday. So anytime you have Ron on, you got to talk about the Sierra Sounds, and then you get into all of this other quantum Bigfoot. He's got some really out there theories on this stuff. And we always get into what's called the air quote woo conversation, right?
Sure,
So
yeah.
let's get into that a little bit. Where are you on all the other weird things? I know you've interviewed people just like me when you say, is there something else that happened? Anything else weird? Well, there was these lights and this craft. And so where are you on that? Because I tell you where I used to be. I used to just put those in 2 separate boxes. My cop brain would put one in a box over here. The other one would go in this box, and they're completely autonomous. They don't have anything to do with each other. I no longer believe that. I believe that there is a connection in most cases. I just don't know what that thread is that combines the 2. So where are you on the woo? And by that, I mean you mentioned it a little earlier, the interdimensional thing, the portals, these things being more than flesh and blood. How do you jumble that around in your brain and come out with something that you can live with on the other side?
Yeah. So there's a few different roads I'll have to go down on this one. So personally, what I feel we're looking at is that it's some sort of like undiscovered great ape creature, right? That's what I personally feel. Now, with my podcast, I love talking to people that it's not you've got to believe it's a great ape or like only woo. I love talking to people and getting their stories and let them present it. and then the listener can decide what they've got going on. Now, some of my most favorite episodes, as I said, Henry Franzoni, but also like Tobe Johnson. Holy mackerel. That was one of the most fun interviews I've ever had. And like, if you haven't read The Owl Moon Lab, it is a trip and it's so much fun. And it's like, you got to go read it. But the thing is, like, how do I, come to grips with that? So here's how I look at it. So like, think of the weirdest animal that you can think of, and then think of the stuff they can do. And then like, think of how does that make sense? And our human mind cannot comprehend the platypus or like, you know, the chameleon or anything like that, like just so, intelligently created. But it's like, who's to say that there's a creature like Bigfoot out there and he can do some wild stuff that if we are looking at it with our limited science could be interpreted as woo stuff. That's how I look at it. But I think there's so many questions we still haven't, someday I hope that we're able to like get that specimen somehow and be like, okay, science, figure it out. Like, I hope we get to that point because like, man, it's been so long, way past in 67, people have been trying to figure this out. And it's like, how much longer is this going to go on? Hundreds of years? Maybe.
I know that's the question I ask myself every day when I get up is how much longer is this going to go on? Because when you do make that discovery, I've said it to people before. They're like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to continue to do a podcast about Bigfoot encounters? Probably no. We'll shift gears and talk about the science behind it. And
absolutely. Because you know what's going to happen, Brian, is if and when this gets discovered, then there has to be the people where they're going to, maybe fight for the conservation of the creature. And what's going to happen, bud, is like us that have these podcasts, we're going to get pulled into stuff so quick. Look at the UFO community. What's happened there? These guys have gotten pulled into stuff so quick. And over the last few years, and like really, helping with, I don't know, I'm thinking of people like Ryan Sprague, who's really involved with stuff. And it's like, I don't know. I think our role as podcasters might change a little bit if we get to the point where Bigfoot is actually like a specimen is discovered and it's public. And if it's an actual, animal type creature, like there's going to be some conservation work that's going to have to happen. Now, if it's not a great ape and it's like an alien alternate universe portal dude, then all bets are off, my dude. I don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly. Well, let's get back to the podcast. You recently had you reached some milestones. Let's talk a little bit about the show.
Oh yeah.
Talk about some of the milestones you've reached, and when people tune in, where can they find it? What are they gonna get when they check out the Bigfoot Society?
Yeah. So as I said, I started in early 2019. I just reached a milestone of 200,000 downloads, which was fun. I'm trying to really build up TikTok right now. Let's say if you're tuning in on the podcast, you're usually going to hear an interview episode where I interview someone. Usually has to do with Bigfoot, sometimes not. Sometimes there's outliers, and that usually comes out on Monday. I also do a live show on Sunday nights where I have a call-in program, and like I'll read reports and whatever, and that's a fun thing. I do record those, and those will usually come out during the week as well. And because of TikTok, I've been getting these people that have been hitting me up, and if they agree to it, I'll record their story, and then I have those on the podcast as members episodes, which you can hear on the Patreon that I have. I've got a few of those. So it's really, there's a mixed bag. You're going to get interviews with people you've heard of, you maybe not have heard of. You're going to have encounter stories sometimes And you're going to have the call-in program. Oh my goodness, that's a mixed bag. That is not just Bigfoot. I mean, we've got everything from like UFO encounters to Burton, my guy Burton from South Dakota, calling in talking about giant owls. And if you hear the story, you're going to see a giant owl. And then Pat the next week's calling in saying, hey, remember that giant owl thing? Well, there's something in my backyard now, and it's pretty tall with red eyes. So I'm like, oh man. So it's not all Bigfoot. We get some weird stuff. It's kind of, like old school AM radio style. It's a fun time. So it's a mixed bag, dude.
Sounds awesome, man. Everybody go over and check out the Bigfoot Society. Jeremiah, check him out on TikTok. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes so you guys can check him out. I've had a blast talking to you, man. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, dude. This has been fun.
They say you don't gotta go home, but you can't stay here.